Hello, Wizards. Today, we're going to analyze some high-stakes heads-up hand histories played between none other than LLinusLLove and Berri. So Linus and Berri are playing 50-100, that is to say 10k NL. Berri's sitting with a very comfortable 574 big blind stack. Linus is sitting at 106. Berri opens his pocket threes. Linus 3-bets king queen off, and Berri calls. We go to a 10-7-3 two-tone flop, and Linus c-bets about 2/3 pot. Now that's on the larger size for a 3-bet pot. Berri makes the call, turn a 4 of diamonds. Again, Linus is c-betting large, and Berri just calls. He's just slow playing his set. We river an ace of diamonds. Linus checks. Berri shoves all in, trying to get max value. Actions on Linus with king high. The bet is just under half pot, and he makes this call. Wow. All right, let's take a look at this in GTO Wizard. I'm using the heads-up simple solutions. Now, these have a 500 NL rake structure, but the cap is very low, so despite that, the solutions are quite similar. Small blind opens, big blind 3-bets, and just notice how wide and linear this 3-bet is. Small blind calls, and we get a 10-7-3 two-tone flop. Now, before we go any further, I'm going to switch to the horizontal mode. This allows me to see individual combinations within the strategy matrix. I find this view a little more useful on flush draw boards. So the first thing I notice is that the solver is splitting its sizing between a large bet and a small bet, right? We've got a large bet here consisting of mostly top pair and overpair for value. And we've got a small bet, which mixes in some underpairs and second pairs and medium strength hands. The medium size isn't really used on this board. Now, 10-7-3 is an interesting flop. For one thing, if we just take a look at the ranges tab, this board gives us the most overpairs, right? Like Berri in position should be 4-betting 10s plus pre-flop. So he doesn't really have any of these overpairs, whereas we have all of them. Despite that, despite the fact that a hand like Jacks is currently ahead of, say, 97% of small blind's range, Jacks only has 77% equity. Ace-10, similar story, has 77% equity despite being ahead of 97% of their range. And I call this the vulnerable nut theorem. So whenever you see this configuration, you've got hands that are way ahead of most of their range, but extremely vulnerable. Typically, the solver is going to want to size up. It's going to want to generate fold equity. It's going to want to fold out overcards. And that's exactly what we see here, right? As the vulnerability of these strong hands decreases, the sizing goes down, right? Aces is not as worried about being outdrawn. So Linus makes it 75 here. I think he went 66, but we'll call it 75 with King Queen. And King Queen can function either as a large or a small bet. It complements either range nicely. He also has the spade, which is important. So he leads out. Actions on Berri in the small blind. And we'll notice that extremely strong hands here, for example, 2-pair plus, these hands are not raising. These hands are pure calling, just slow playing. In fact, the only real value hand that raises is top pair, top kicker, right? These vulnerable ace-10 hands without a spade. These hands are just vulnerable enough to want to raise, and at the same time, just strong enough to get called by worse. So Berri makes the call with bottom set, and we turn a 4 of diamonds. Let's take a look at the turn reports. So after Linus has taken this very aggressive line, we can see that the solver continues with a larger size across most turns, right? Either 150% shove or a half pot c-bet. And the reasoning is that once you start taking a very polarized line on the flop in a 3-bet pot, the solver typically intends to continue to bet geometrically to get stacks in by the river. Geometrically is just a fancy term for saying betting an equal fraction of the pot on each street to try and get stacks in, force villain to call as wide as possible. So here we see that, for example, a hand like King 10 is a great hand to continue barreling. It doesn't necessarily want to shove, it wants to apply pressure over 3 streets. More vulnerable hands, for example, ace 10, king 10, jacks without a spade, queens without a spade. These hands don't mind just getting it in two straights. These hands will shove. But the other value hands typically use a smaller sizing, try and get it in against a wider range. So Linus bets just over half pot here. Their game, they're playing a little deeper, so he can size up a bit more. So in this case, Berri's sitting there with pocket threes. And again, we see that these very strong hands, these 2-pair plus hands, they're just calling. There's no need to raise these hands, right? There's only like a half pot bet left on the river anyway. It's very easy to get stacks in later. In position is not in a rush to raise these strong hands. Now, more vulnerable hands, like for example, these top pair hands, these can shove and try and just maximize their equity realization. These hands don't have a whole lot of river cards that they like. Most river cards will depreciate their value, and they're quite vulnerable to being outdrawn. So Berri just flats with his set of threes, and we river the ace of diamonds. So the ace is a pretty interesting river card because Linus really doesn't have much ace-x in this line, right? Ace-x does not play this aggressively. It'll bet smaller or check earlier. It doesn't want to turn itself into a bluff. So if we take a look at the ranges tab, we can see that Linus, he has plenty of good hands, but Berri has all of the best hands because Berri has all of the ace-x. Despite that, there's only a half pot left, right? A hand like jacks is not going to check fold for its last half pot bet. So these hands shove anyway because they're going to get the money in regardless. And furthermore, they're going to get called by worse, right? Villain still has to call all of these strong top pair hands. They have to call some 7x. Of course, they're going to call their ace-x as well. But at this point, it's mostly just ace-x of spades. So let's go back. Now, Linus can't bet everything. He does have to develop some checks because if he bets everything, he'll be over bluffing and Berri can just start calling him down way too light. Now, Berri, he's shoving with second pair plus for value. And it seems like, oh, you're shoving Jack 10 here. But yeah, let's take a look. Jack 10 has 83% equity against Linus's checking range, right? This checking range has a ton of give-ups and a few traps. So Linus checks, Berri shoves. We take a look at King Queen here. Surprise, surprise, King of Spades, Queen of Hearts is a pure call. What a machine. And this is kind of a fun hero call, right? We have to think about, does this hand beat bluffs? First of all, if it doesn't beat bluffs, you just cannot call. And if we take a look at Berri's range, and we filter for shoves that are trash hands, we can see King Queen is ahead of all of these bluffs. Now we're behind all of their value bets, of course, but we do have some nice blockers against those value bets. For example, blocking King 10, Queen 10, Ace Queen. So not a bad hand. When he shoves, we can see that King Queen has 26% equity. Now this is a half pot bet. Pot odds dictate you need at least 25%. So with the spade blocker, it's just strong enough to call. And Linus does need to mix in some bluff catchers. He can't just fold everything, which is why all the 10x plus calls. And we mix in some hero calls with King High. What a hand. Really nice call by Linus at the end there, even though he didn't win the pot. And really nice slow play by Berri Sweet. Hand number 2, we've got Berri Sweet with ace-ace and LLLove fighting with ace-5 of clubs. Berri opens on the button. Linus 3 bets, his ace-5 suited. Berri 4 bets, and Linus calls. We see a 4-5-6 flop. Linus checks, and Berri checks behind. 8 of clubs. Linus decides to lead out small here, a little under 1/3 pot. Berri calls. 3 of clubs, kind of a wet board. Berri doesn't mind. He shoves it in. Linus, with about a pot size behind, has a decision to make, and he finds the call with ace-5. The 6-5-4 is quite a double-edged board. On the one hand, most of your overpairs would love to fold out overcards. On the other hand, Linus has all the two pairs and sets and straights. So you don't really have the nut advantage, right? If we take a look at the equity graph, Linus, the preflop defender, has many of the strongest hands here. So you can't size up and get too aggressive, otherwise you'll just get shoved off your equity. If we take a look at just the overpairs, Berri wants to bet overpairs that are more vulnerable more often and use a larger size, right? Like we can see 8s, 9s, 10s, jacks, always betting and typically using a larger size. And as these overpairs become less and less vulnerable to overcards, for example, ace-ace, the sizing goes down and they even start checking more. So Berri's decision to check ace-ace does make sense in this configuration. He checks it back, and we get the 8 of clubs. So here, Linus decides to lead out for 30% pot. And the solver doesn't really like this sizing. It prefers to size up using maybe half pot or 75% as a probe bet. But okay, this sizing is used for some hands. We can say it's mostly mixing straights for value, weak hands as bluffs, whereas a larger size is mostly mixing vulnerable top pair hands that want to generate more fold equity, as well as second pair hands and flush draws as bluffs. Ace-5 in particular doesn't mind. It can be grouped into any of these strategies. It's a very flexible semi-bluff. So Linus leads out and actions on Berri. And we can see that a hand like aces is just calling here. And again, this is similar to the last concept where when the SPR is low, that is to say stacks are short relative to the pot, there's only an 80% pot left on the river. You don't need to rush it in position to get the money. Oftentimes it's much better to call and let them bluff their stack off or value bet worse. So Berri with his aces just smooth calls here. And we get a 3 of clubs river. So this is a very connected run out, and we can see that Linus's range consists 40% straights, and the rest of it is mainly garbage, right? It's very polarized. We can see that polarized shape in the equity distribution. And whenever you see that, what you can expect is that the checking range is mostly a give-up range, right? Like the checks here, if we just take a look at the breakdown tab, when Linus checks, most of his range is just nothing. Like he's got maybe a few overpairs, a few low pairs. Most of it is just nothing. If we take a look at the EV of his checking range, right, most of them are just 0 EV hands and then a few very high EV hands in there as traps. So Linus with his ace-5 checks, and it's worth pointing out that the solver actually just shoves this hand. However, it does check ace-5 of hearts. So Linus checks, actions on Berri, and he's not afraid. He just wants to get some value with his ace-ace. Linus is going to have to call more than 40%, but he doesn't. In fact, the solver folds almost 90% here. And this is quite typical of polarized ranges. When they check, it's mostly just going to overfold because they're all 0 EV hands anyway, right? Like 10-9 wasn't going to win the pot in the first place. You're not being bluffed off the best hand with 10-9. Ace-5, however, is a pure call, calling 100% of the time, regardless of suit, despite the fact that it doesn't get here too often. So well played to both players. Really interesting hand. A nice hero call from Linus at the end there, and nice slow play with aces by Berri. All right, Wizards, that's it for the video. We hope you enjoyed. Please comment, like, subscribe, and of course, if you want to discuss the theory with us, join our Discord. We'd be happy to talk more about it there.